Well, thank you, because, Zoom doesn't seem to want me to show the slides. So I'm glad to have an AV assistant here. As you can see, we originally tried to do this in February. But if you're talking about an earlier century, nothing has changed since then. Many of us, those of us who are, birders, bird lovers, tend to have a lot of bird books on our shelves. And, we may also have some of the coffee table type books. Next slide, please. But we generally think of these days bird books as referring to identification guides. I call this the, anyway, I have a joke I have forgotten, but this is the kind of thing many of us grew up with. The Peterson guide with the little, acupuncture indications of what are the key field markings. And we all expect bird books to have either pretty accurate paintings or, next slide, photographs. This is the Crossley ID guide, which merges a whole bunch of photos of a particular species, like the Baltimore Oriole, in different plumages, ages, positions. And it can be a useful reference because this is, hopefully what you see out there in a tree resembles, one of the pictures here. Next slide. But a lot of us, what most of us know about artists for bird books, and in the current century, of course, David Allen Sibley. The last century, you may have heard of Louis Agassiz Fuertes, named after the naturalist, Roger Torrey Peterson. And those are the ones that, most of us can't easily come up with other names. And in the 19th century, of course, John James Audubon. And I have here, these all seem to have 3 names. But earlier than that, it's a big blank for most of us. Excuse me. So next, please. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of bird illustration, basically since the invention of the printing press, and why some of these early things do or do not resemble recognizable birds. For instance, next. This is, there were many editions of this. Hortus Sanitatis, which I think is like Garden of Health. And this just seems to be some sort of proof page. You can see where the illustrated capital letters need to go in. But let's see, one of these images is supposed to be a nightingale, and then you have, some sort of water bird and blackbird, bottom right, Marilla, blackbird. So nobody is going to recognize anything from these. In fact, I have some more amusing pictures from it later on. But next, what's easier to recognize is as we got further into the 1500s, and this is a northern lapwing, which some of you may know has made an appearance, not this particular bird, made an appearance in Maryland a few times in recent decades. I remember the one, it was something like 2005 or 6, appeared in Frederick County and caused quite a stir. Jean, you probably remember that. Next. Barn owl, another recognizable one. And these were woodcuts, but beautifully done. Next. And peregrine falcon. But after a while, things advanced next to using metal plates and for etchings and engravings. So here is a hoopoe, which is on my, bucket list, but I'm not sure the next time I'm going to get back to Europe or anything with a chance to see it. Next. I'm mostly going to be showing you really cool pictures. You don't have to take notes on the history of this. These are pretty cool. The ostrich and the cassowary. In front of the cassowary is near a rather dubiously constructed pyramid, but they're definitely recognizable birds. Next. And then, we moved on to etchings. This is a summer tanager, even though it doesn't look like it was alive when it posed for this picture. If you look at the eye, that's not real plausible. But, this is from one of the early books about the American South. Next. I think this is supposed to be a secretary bird. Again, hand colored at this point, and much higher quality of production. But then next, then we go back a step. In the early 1800s, Thomas Buick put together some books on British birds, and he made wood engravings, not just woodcuts, but really extremely detailed, high quality images that were actually very small. Next. These are sort of referred to as vignettes on the title pages. And I meant to go measure, but they're really just a couple of inches tall and extremely detailed. So he was quite a bit of an artist, but basically wood engravings was, relegated to the past. And from then on, next, we really saw the, engravings based on metal plates. Now, this is a page from Alexander Wilson's American Ornithology. And I will tell you my bias. I love Wilson. He doesn't have the beautiful, scene setting that Audubon did. He was just, a little bit before, but I love the way he represents these birds. And a lot of it is just how many can I fit on a page? And yet I just think this stuff is glorious, and I'm going to have other examples of it later. Next. And, here we have a woodcock, and this is the time of year. But again, sometimes they had other people fill in a background. Next. Wilson did 9 volumes for American Ornithology. And then there were 4 more volumes in a supplement. And you see this Bonaparte's supplement. And it was Charles Lucien Bonaparte, who was, yes, the nephew of Napoleon. And so these are, later with more of a background. But again, beautiful works of recognizable birds. And of course, next, there we go. I can't leave him out completely. An aquatint is a variety of etching. And again, this is a very dramatic scene. You have the mockingbirds defending the nest against the, the vicious attacking rattlesnake, and, all kinds of vegetation, great detail. And you could probably get a print of this if you're willing to, I don't know, trade in your car or something. And then things change. Next. Lithographs in the mid-1800s, which are basically the ancestor of offset printing that we do today. And, for modern books and magazines, if we still have magazines. And as a collector, I have, let me just asterisk here. Some of these pictures are from items in my own collection. Many of them are taken off the internet or from auction catalogs or reference books. But personally, I'm not a fan of lithographs because to me, they're two-dimensional, and engravings and etchings to me, I really like that slight three-dimensionality. But I will be getting back to John Gould when I talk about how these get sold. Okay, next, one thing I've noticed as I go through all these bird pictures, there seems to be a sort of standard pose. It's almost like, high school kids getting their yearbook photo. So let's run through these fairly fast. On a branch facing right, next. On a branch facing right. On a branch facing right. Yep, same thing. Next. Two. Yep, same pose. And I think one more. And then somebody decided to do it differently. Or maybe they were copying some artwork in a mirror or something. But it's a very standard pose. Now, next. So in the 1500s and the 1600s, Europeans went out, across the oceans, seeking natural resources to exploit. And a lot of these expeditions in the 1500s, they didn't want to share the information outside their own country because, if somebody comes back and says, guess what I found in Brazil or wherever, or someplace in Africa, vast amounts of, I don't know, gold or exploitable materials, they didn't want people to know. But in the 1600s, it started to get more publicized. Okay, and they focused on these other countries in the bird books too. Next. Here is the Virginian nightingale, which obviously is a cardinal, which, they're all singing noisily this time of year. Next. And this is, correct me, somewhat, Jabiru, is it pronounced? Jabiru star. Again, from the New World. And unfortunately, I don't know Latin from that era, but it's kind of easy to figure out what this is. Next. And then I had mentioned Catesby. Here we go, the natural history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. And I think that's a blue grosbeak, as I recall. And in general, bird books started to evolve to have a regional focus. Next. Again, my honey, Alexander Wilson, put out his multi-volume set of American Ornithology. I just think this stuff is gorgeous, even if it's not, like Audubon. Next. That's another favorite, even if the falcon in the middle would be eating those other birds. Next. And of course, Audubon. Another dramatic scene, and ivory-billed woodpecker. And here's a quote. Now and then an individual of the species may be accidentally seen in Maryland. So, that may be on the overall bird records here. Next. He did write an accompanying book to the prints. It's mostly text with little sketches of bird intestines and things, and a lot of description of where he traveled and who hosted him and what he shot. But it does have some supplemental information in it. Next. Here was a book focusing on the birds of Britain, or one of several things, by George Edwards. Next. And again, back to Buick and his woodcuts, the house sparrow looks very recognizable. And of course, back then they weren't in North America. Next, another dramatic British bird. And one more. And this was a series of books that came out. And if you look at the dates at the bottom, 1770 to 1829. So it's almost 60 years, a period of time from when these volumes were issued. But, you know, again, great art, impressive write-up, and focusing on a part of Europe that I guess a lot of people cared about. Next. So here's the issue. Next. When you have a series, highly illustrated, took years to put together and produce, you need to get subscribers, ideally, or at least back then. And, you know, in recent decades, it was the Handbook of Birds of the World. And hoisting a couple of these is good exercise for the arms, but they are fabulous, fabulous books. Next. And of course, the Birds of North America life histories used to be available just in paper. And a lot of these things have changed. Now you can get it online, but you also have to be a subscriber. Next. So when Alexander Wilson was looking for people to support his American ornithology, it took a while. Next. And this list, I circled one of, not in real life, but this is a very interesting list. I don't know how much of this you can see, but in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, yes. So they may have some of these books still in, you know, the library in Monticello. In Maryland, you see the Baltimore Library. So this is, you know, more than 200 years ago. And St. Mary's College Library. And in the district, you know, the Georgetown Library. There's just some names we still recognize here. And obviously this wasn't inexpensive even back then. Next. And presumably, there we go, Charles Lucien Bonaparte. Presumably people paid extra for that. And next. And of course, you know, Birds of America. Oh, that is glorious. I mean, these are, I don't know if individual prints are even available for less than something in the 5 figures. And I'm talking about the, you know, elephant folios size. If you want just one of the later octavo editions, you can find those. But it just, beautiful stuff. And again, as an envious collector, you know, I certainly admire this. Next. Well, with the advent of lithography, you started getting bird, as opposed to hand-colored engravings or whatever, you started getting bird books accessible to more members of the public. There was a rising middle class in many countries. People could afford this. They wanted to show off their erudition and all that. So the Naturalist Library, and this says 1833 to 1843, there were many, many, many volumes. It wasn't just birds. And it was a lot more affordable and very popular. Oh, I see somebody, okay. Next. And then Gould. Now, again, that went on for decades. It wasn't him particularly. I referred to John Gould, bird, you know, pictures. Lithographs are us. I mean, they had a whole stable of people producing these and selling them. And again, back in my real collecting days, I would occasionally be contacted by dealers or whatever saying, I have these great Gould prints. And I go, no, I'm prejudiced against lithographs. Okay, next. Now, the AOU is what? The American Ornithologists Union. And they're the ones who decide, pick up the taxonomic order and give it a good shake every now and then. Lumping and splitting and this and that. But before then, how did we classify birds? Next. Yeah. Well, the original distinction, next, was of course between clean birds and unclean birds. What, you can eat a grouse, I guess, but not a vulture. Next. Keep going. One more. Aristotle divided birds into land birds, shore birds, and water birds. All right, that sort of makes sense. Next, and there are three more. Right, Pliny the Elder, also several thousand years ago. If you think about it, I don't know, there's some, morphological, if that's the right word, morphology reasons to divide them up that way. Next. But as we get into more recent centuries, we have different attempts. Pierre Bellon, French Comparative Anatomy. Gessner just said alphabetical order. Aldrovandi, this one has like 5 very strange. The bathing in dust or what, I have no idea where that came from. And next, there's 2 more for him. So, people have been concerned about taxonomy for a while. Next. But wait, there's more. Willoughby and Ray, okay, wait, were the mid-1600s. Linnaeus, we have all heard of. We use the Linnaean naming system. And Count de Brisson, keep going. That was weird. And the Count de Buffon, who had his own way of looking at things. He categorized birds from the most to the least interesting. So that's one way to do it. Next. Now, what is a species? People are still arguing about that now that we have the genetic analysis. But John Ray, as in Willoughby and Ray, 1600s, it's a species, breeds true. Okay, that's been a useful definition. Linnaeus thought species were fixed. Next. The Count de Buffon, who was the late 1700s, thought species were varieties differing due to diet, climate, and degenerate reproduction. Next. Yes. Can you all read that? Okay. So he had, again, some interesting opinions on things. So while we're talking about bird taxonomy, Buffon also liked to come up with his own names. Now on the left, there's, again, it's very small, but it's what different people, what other people call the bird, such as, yes, Linnaeus and Brisson, Aldrovandi, Pennant, Latham, all these. Well, that is the common term, but he called it the great sea swallow. Next. and the purple gallinule in its typical habitat, obviously. He called the sultana hen or porphyrion. And actually from that drawing, it looks like it's sort of King Kong size compared to the building next to it. The next one, gallinules, the granetta and the smurring. We need more of these, you know, colorful names. Next. This one took a little longer to track down. The spring bergeronette. And next, the barking barge, which is not a name I think most people would suggest. Next. Now, if you're a birder, you might recognize these. American fig eaters are a lot of warblers. The pine fig eater, the yellow-throated cinereous fig eater, you know, cerulean fig eater. So these names have been more or less, you know, kept for a lot of these. Next. And the last one that's kind of hard to, oh, no, two more, sorry. The punctured bangle, maybe because it has little dots on it. Next. The minister. I don't know, indigo bunting. Now, here are some especially peculiar portrayals, which next, it's kind of weird because obviously people knew how to represent birds recognizably for centuries, for millennia. You know, there are pictures on ancient walls in Egypt of recognizable birds. So obviously it's not like people looked at them weird. It's just, this is a painting, but when you're talking about reproducing it, you know, via printing press, you had other barriers. Next. Here, for instance, is a golden eagle and an osprey. Again, not very recognizable. And I do want to point out also that a number of these birds were not rendered from specimens in front of the artist. It might be from a description, somebody's you know, sketch of what they'd seen. It's it can be very difficult. And speaking of description, next. For a long time, there was the belief that birds of paradise did not have feet. And the reason is that when ships came back from the New World, the Western Hemisphere, they had a way to, they could stuff and keep the skins and the feathers, but the softer parts, such as legs and feet, at that time, they had no way to preserve. So a lot of these birds came back with no feet, and they started to believe that, you know, the Europeans were believing they didn't have it. Next. Here's another example, you know, it has fancy feathers, but no legs, no feet. Next. Oh, I think I showed you this one, right? That's another peculiar portrayal in terms of habitat. Next, yes, another Ani, you know, posing for the artist. Next. Now, another result of having to generate the basic plate that would be used for reproduction from scratch is people often ended up copying other existing art. So on the left is an Audubon picture, and on the right is something from one of the Cassell's Natural History. Gosh, I see a resemblance there. And I guess there was no real, you know, copyright protection for this. Next. But even our favorites, Wilson and Audubon, if you look at the kite on the left, which was Alexander Wilson, and Audubon on the right, it really looks like it was just flipped. Next. This one is very amusing. On the left, this great auk is referred to as penguin worm or worm. It belonged to a man, I forget, was he Danish, Swedish? Worm was his last name. And it was represented this way. See that white band around the neck? The actual bird, which is now extinct, did not have that. It just happened to be a pet, and that was a collar that was put on it. So it got drawn as if this were a feature of its plumage. So that's another kind of mistake that got perpetuated for a bit. Next. And again, on the left is the French edition of Buffon, which is the original was French. And there's a decent rendering of a hoopoe. But on the right, the English edition, it looks like a rather poor copy. So here's next. Anhinga, as reported by Margrave. Yeah, snake bird. I see why it's called that. But again, not exactly what it looks like. Next. And of course, the flamingo up top, next, is a far cry from how Audubon rendered it. Next. And then occasional strange things get in. Look in the upper left corner. I put Stella Luna. I don't know if any of you have had that book read that book to a child or grandchild, but it's, what is it, a bat that gets raised by birds or vice versa. And so, things with wings that fly were often sort of lumped together. Next. And then there's the question we've been wondering for a long time. How do they taste? Next. Let's go back to when birding was to birds the way fishing is to fish. You weren't just looking at them, you were catching them to eat. Next. And often that had to do with falconry. So there was a book on falconry by Frederick II, even though for some reason it didn't get published for centuries. Next. So let's go back to that Anhinga. Willoughby and Ray in the mid-1600s said, I have eaten of its flesh, but it is not much better than the flesh of a gull. Next. If you've ever looked with your local mockingbird with its stomach growling, be aware its flesh is esteemed excellent, but you're not actually allowed to eat them. Next. Flamingos. The ancients speak of them as being exquisite games. Next. On the other hand, don't eat that house sparrow, even though it would be legal, I assume. Its flesh is indifferent food. Next. And that beautifully posed Ani with the Roman nose, it's akin to the parrots and not good to eat. Next. But of course, peacocks have been a delicacy for what, millennia? In my opinion and to my palate, the flesh of young peacocks is very tender, delicate, and well tasted. And then there are the meals sort of lost to time, can never be reproduced. The passenger pigeon, Audubon said it affords tolerable eating. Next. On the other hand, of Carolina parrot, I think their flesh very indifferent. And the dodo. So it was fat and so much, it was 3 or 4 dodos can sometimes suffice to feed 100 sailors. We'll never know. This one's fun, birds as medicine. Next. Hummingbirds. It is reported that the powder of this bird taken inwardly cures the falling sickness, that is epilepsy. Next. And the Watson, if you, let's see, smoke of its feathers can bring people to the right mind. The ashes of the feathers taken inwardly cure syphilis. Okay, next, the good old chicken. Now, if I were there with you all in person, I could share, I have a page from one of the, an excerpt from Ornithology by Willoughby and Reg in 1678 about medicinal uses for a chicken, basically. And of course, there's things like chicken soup, sure. And even chicken fat can cure chapped lips. That's all reasonable. But then there's, you know, the dung cures the colic and it's and the pain of the womb. So, you know, next time someone says, oh, I have terrible cramps, give them some chicken dung. And there's just a whole bunch of weird things in there. And, but there's like a whole page of it. So, you know, we just stick to chicken soup as a cure-all and, you know, maybe soft-boiled eggs or something, but there used to be a lot more. Next. Let's not forget about birds as aesthetic objects. Next. I had an African gray parrot for more than 35 years. So I'm always appreciative of the beauty of parrots. Next. And Edward Lear, you think, oh, you know, the limericks and the owl and the pussycat. He was also a bird artist. He painted this at age 20. He was extremely talented. Next. And here we go, you know, Buick wrote about, you know, pigeons, and we all know that the pigeons, the feral pigeons in this country were brought here originally, you know, for racing and, you know, domestic possession. But if you go to, I'm in Montgomery County and I used to go to the county fair, and one of my favorite exhibits there were the fancy birds, including, you know, the fancy chickens and the fancy pigeons and things like that. Next. But it wasn't just appearance. Here is a rating of songbirds by mellowness of tone, sprightly notes, plaintive notes, compass, I guess that means range, and execution. And unsurprisingly, the nightingale rates very high. And, you know, again, these are British birds, but some others are pretty low. But somebody, you know, maybe a musician got very into this comparative rating. Next. Okay, fake news about bird behavior. Next. My absolute favorite. I call this the pretzel bird. I have no idea what's the story behind this. And you notice there's something happening in the bottom left. There's one bird. I don't know if it's leaving prey or what, but this is clearly something that needs to be put in a caption contest. Next. There was the belief that swans lived for centuries. Also that they would, let's see, peck themselves on the breast and feed their blood to their chicks or something like that. Next. And there was a long centuries of belief that swallows hibernated in the winter. And it really wasn't until basically a bit over 200 years ago that, you know, you had people saying things, no, wait a minute, I have a letter from someone down in the southern US who saw them on a particular date, and then, you know, a week or so later, they made it up to where we are. But this belief that swallows hibernated, it's just astounding that that myth lasted so long. Next. And speaking of myths, a four-legged duck, if you look closely, I don't know, Bronwyn, if you can circle the back leg. There we go. And as they point out, it really looks like the puffin, except in the number of feet. So it may have been, again, a mutant. You know, it happens with extra body parts. Next. So, you know, there is a resemblance. Then the last real section here, birds as moral examples. They care for their old parents and feed them. And, you know, this is in French. Next. House sparrows can't catch a break. They're troublesome because of their subtlety, their cunning, and their obstinacy to abide in places which suit them. We know this. This is very true. And they're also apparently, no, go back. Apparently, you know, disgustingly lustful and just not admirable. Next. Woodpeckers. This is weird. Nature has condemned them to incessant toil and slavery. It shuns all society, even that of its own kind. So, you know, they're not all lovable. Next. The hummingbird. Yes, this is a Victorian poem. I am not going to, I'll just read you the first verse. The hummingbird, so fairy-like and bright, it lives among the sunny flowers, a creature of delight. And there's another 12 or 13 verses like that. So, you know, if you need to take some insulin, do that before reading this. Next. But even in the 20th century, these prairie chickens are described as vain and jealous lovers. So it's really not just something from the Victorian era that we assign all this, you know, morality to. Okay, next. Now, wait, I'm going to run through some quotes, and we can just go through this fast. As it says, the quotes are from Thomas Buick, so that's very early 1800s, and some of my favorite pictures from Alexander Wilson, just a couple of them. Next. Something like a society in each county for the purpose of collecting a variety of natural history observations would be extremely useful. Well, we certainly agree with that. And next, a good naturalist cannot be a bad man. Thank you. That's all my slides, and I hope you've enjoyed the pictures and some of the really weird beliefs and renderings from earlier centuries. And I'll be happy to take any questions. I can't promise I can answer, but I'll give it a try.
Thank you, Janet. That was so much fun. I love looking at all of those pictures. Do we have any questions or comments for Janet? If you can raise your hand, I'll call on you, or you can put it in the chat box over there. Can you tell us a little bit more about your personal collection?
Well, some of it, a lot of it goes back to what I'll call BP, before parenthood, when I, you know, had a little more disposable income. But I think I started, you know, I have some artwork I got at, I don't know, just like flea markets, you know, where I paid $3 for a print torn out of a book and then $20 to get it framed or whatever. But there's a lot of stuff out there. And over the years, I got more knowledgeable and selective. And I did attend a few auctions and didn't buy anything, but just seeing the stuff in person is just very rewarding for me. And again, my collection, let's see, I have, some things are just a few pages that were taken out, books that were disassembled and individual prints have been sold. My own collection, I don't know who to leave it to, where, you can't guarantee somebody isn't going to take it and rip it apart and sell each illustration, but I like to read the text also, because that's very interesting. And that's why I try to stick to things that are either in English or a language I can fake reading. So, no German for me, but, French, or I can get some people to help me with Latin. But I don't know. I have some things that are small. I have some things that are larger. I have some things that are falling apart, which is why I was able to afford them, because, the spine is crumbling. But it's beautiful, and it takes you back to an earlier time, and it's informative. We all tend to think that the world sort of began when we did. And again, most of us have a huge blank before Audubon if we care about birds.
Are you keeping, are there any modern artists of birds that seem to be rising that in terms of national acclaim?
Recent, wow. Well, probably if somebody had a sibling. Early in our relationship, my husband wooed me by getting me a Roger Tory Peterson print. And recent, again, I haven't been in the market for stuff, but obviously there are a lot of talented people out there. It's really a matter of personal taste somewhat, but look around, see what you see. If you have a book with some art, oh, I know what I have. There were, what was it? A field guide to something in rare, seldom seen birds. It was a satirical book that came out some decades ago. I actually have an original from one of those. So it's, a non-existent bird. But
so we have a question. Are there any good books of this sort that have been digitized or are available to browse online? Because they looked for the Willoughby and Ray and couldn't find any copies for less than $2,000.
I don't think I paid that much, but again, it was a long time ago. There's a lot that's been digitized. I think, again, this is something you have to do as an internet search. There are many sources. I recently bought a 200-year-old book, not very much money, as a gift, not on birds, as a gift for a family member. And then I discovered it had been digitized online, but still, I think, if you care about this, getting your hands on it can be an improvement. And also, you need to store this stuff carefully. And in a high humidity, or lately low humidity place like Maryland, a place with changeable weather, you really do need to protect things from, sun exposure and excessive temperature changes and things like that. References. Okay. Let me make a note of that. And, some of this also, I found a book, something like The History of Ornithology. I looked at, again, it's a mix of sources. Why don't I make a note And I will try and send something to you, Bronwyn, and then.
Yeah. What I found was quite interesting is that, you know, you would think that all of the people there collecting birds, that they would be drawing from the actual bird, all the dead birds that they were collecting and shooting. And so to find out that they would just have some, like a person saying, no, it's a bigger nose or a shorter wingspan or this and that they're just telling them what the bird looked like, it was very interesting.
Yeah, well, again, if you had somebody exploring, you know, and making notes on all kinds of things in another country or another part of the country, they might just sketch it in, you know, in a book and come back and hand that to somebody and say, take my word for it. This was something that was about, you know, a foot long and blue on top or whatever. I do have some 19th century art. I'm not totally, you know, later 19th century. I'm not totally purging all, you know, lithographs from my collection. When I'm asked a list of references, do you mean specific titles of the books I talked about or more contemporary?
It was the list of references from this presentation. So I think that the books that were
okay,
so that they can look for.
Yeah, and again, a lot of these, I got images from auction catalogs and things like that. And you know, that's also the question. Do you just want to see pictures, or if you want the text? And I can't guarantee some of these have been turned into text. It's not easy to, you know, take all these ancient pages and put them on a scanner or whatever. Well, thank you all for your interest. I love sharing these amusing pictures, especially.
I have a question. I was wondering, you did not include photography. And no. I wondered what your thought was associated with natural history or bird photography.
Again, that's something that would have started kind of at my cutoff of the mid-19th century. My thoughts on it, it's a challenge. I admire the people who come up with wonderful bird pictures. A lot of folks in Maryland Ornithological Society are superb bird photographers. It's not something I've gotten into more than, oh, look what's come to the little, you know, water feature in my yard, get out my phone, you know, click. No, wait, that's what a camera's click. So now it's just, and it's not something I'm into. I think there's some very talented people who produce extraordinary work. It's just my own aesthetic preference.
Okay. And do you have a listing of museums or that specialize in the natural history or bird art other than the Audubon Key West House?
There's, what is it, the New York, some New York library, or the Audubon, this is decades ago, I'm forgetting what library in New York had an exhibit of many of Audubon's original watercolors, and they just hung up dozens or hundreds of them. And I remember going up to New York, and it was just extraordinary. But I'm not sure. I think a lot of university libraries have some of these books. And again, you know, I'd like to leave my collection where it will be appreciated. So if you all have any suggestions for a library that doesn't already have a lot of this, I mean, Hopkins may have, what, Hopkins has an Audubon or something, you know, there's, yeah, I see Gina's nodding. So again, I'm open to it. you know, I could maybe just give it all to an auctioneer at some point, but, you know, benefit my kid. But, you know, I'd like it to be preserved where people can see these things and enjoy it. And another thing I should mention is the older volumes, the paper is in great shape generally. It might be a little foxed, but it's not falling apart like a lot of things printed more recently when paper went to more, you know, having pulp in it rather than cotton fibers. So a lot of these things are centuries old, and certain colors don't last as well as others, but just the overall experience of these is really cool. And you know, I found the older I get, the more connected I feel to the past, because so much of what's now described as history are my memories. You know, I think that's true for a lot of us.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, are there any other questions for Janet?
I was just going to say about the double elephant folios that were down at Hopkins. They used to be locked up behind a fence kind of a thing that you couldn't get to them. But I know there was a controversy years ago, and I don't know how it ended up, but Hopkins wanted to disassemble all of the double elephant folios and sell them plate by plate to get money for the university. And I don't know how that ever ended, if they still have the 4-volume set or if they sold the plates.
I mean, if you own something, that's your right, but it's really, and actually the folio was originally produced as separate sheets. It's not ripping pages out of a book in the way we think of it, where it's a mix of text and illustrations. But still, you know, it's kind of sad that things do get disassembled over time.
And as I mentioned in the chat box, the Maryland State Law Library in Annapolis has a copy, and they did a presentation for us. So you can look at that on our YouTube channel on that.
They have Audubon, you're saying? Or
yep.
Wilson?
Audubon.
Okay.
It's an interesting story, so you can look it up. You can on the website. They will have the history of why they have a collection of that in the Legislative Law Library at Annapolis.
If I remember correct, Brian, when they were the individual sheets that they're stored in drawers, they're not a bound volume. They're the individual.
Right, you're right. You're right.
Individual plates.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there are books on the production of, you know, Birds of America, and you know, people who know more about art than I do can really appreciate some of the finer points, what was involved. But again, you know, you have hand-colored stuff. It was maybe somebody different painting in the background. It was just really quite an enterprise, and it was not cheap back then. You know, 200 years ago, it was not cheap either. But again, it's you know, it's a beautiful. It's beautiful, period. And again, we all have different preferences. Some people collect, you know, sculptures. Some, like, you know, whoever was asking about photography. But if you're a bird lover, I mean, once my husband asked me, you know, can we put up some art other than birds? And I said, why? But, you know, I have things that are just, you know, modern copies, but anyway. Well, again, thank you so much. I'm glad we overcame the technical difficulties this time. And
yeah, and thank you thank you, Janet, for coming back and sharing your collection, your passion for birds in a completely kind of different way for us. I think you've inspired us to go out to some bookshops and start looking through and seeing what we can find as well, because they are treasure troves of beauty and information and history and all things that are really cool. So
go quick while there's still bookshops.
Yeah. All right. Well, everybody, I think our next Must Learn Thursday is still on birds. It's May 4th, and it is Elizabeth Hargrave, the creator of Wingspan. So I hope that you will join us. It's how she came up with this, how she developed the game. It is very ecologically and ornithologically significant and true. So if you haven't played, we have game nights and tutorials at the museum. We had our first one a couple of weeks ago, and it was a wonderful, lots of fun. So learn more about Wingspan on May 4th. And until then, stay well, stay curious, stay outside, keep looking at those birds. Take care, everybody.
Bye.